Besides the hook and the thread, there are just 3 ingredients in the Coachman, a trout fly in Mary Orvis Marbury's book, Favorite Flies and Their Histories. Tying it from the illustration in her book, guessing at the ingredients. I'm using a number 8 hook. The body on the fly is Peacock herl. I'm going to use 2 herls. After laying down a base of thread, I'll bring my thread back up an eye length behind the eye and wrap in those herls. Now, one of the things that I want to focus on with this fly is to get that square back on the herl. And I've discovered that when I put the herl in a rope or when I twist it, I don't get nice straight fibers. So I'm going to do something Mary probably did not do, and that is put a little bit of super glue on the top of my hook shank. That will help cement in the herl, and then I'll move my thread just halfway up. Grab those 2 herl, get them married together, and then see if I can wrap and get a square back. I've got a few fibers sticking out there, but I think that's pretty good. So I'm really focusing on wrapping the herl on edge, very much like I would wrap a hackle, and that is giving me a fairly good cylinder. I'm also tying this in by the butt ends first, so that if I have any taper, which I will now as I get to the tips of the feather of the herl, that if I have any taper, it'll taper towards the front, keeping that cylinder look. And I have to make sure that I'm leaving plenty of room for a hackle and a wing. So 3 wraps over the top, 3 tight wraps in underneath to secure it. Then I can clip out, in this case, the tips of the herl. I'm going to tie the hackle in before I tie the wing in, and I am just using this brown hen saddle. I don't know what Mary would have used. Maybe something a little stiffer than this, but I think this approximates fairly well the look. So I just take my hackle pliers, grab the tip of the feather, isolate that little triangle, and then I cut that even shorter. So all I have is that little triangle to tie in by, and then I don't have to clip it after I tie it in. Make sure I grab that well. Then the feather is fairly long, so I'm just going to wrap it without pliers and pull back on the fibers. So this is very much in the style of what today we would call a soft hackle wet fly. Most of Mary's flies were wet flies. Occasionally she talks about them needing to float, but the whole concept of dry fly fishing wasn't really in vogue yet in the late 1800s, 1892, when her book was published. So I'll just wrap until I'm out of barbs on the feather, and then I'll pull back on all of these. I've got a few that got stray out in front, but if I pull back, then I can wrap up over those. And then I'm going to wrap back up a little ways to give myself room to tie in the wing. I'll go ahead and snap that stem out of there. Stem, or call it the quill. For the wing, I am using these white feathers. These are cheap craft store feathers, and I'm thinking that maybe these are a goose shoulder. What I have found though is that they compress pretty significantly. So I have cut 2 pieces from opposing feathers, and they're quite a bit wider than the gape of the hook. But because they tend to compress, I'm doing that to give myself a decent size wing. So I'm just sizing the wing, trying to match the illustration. Pinch wrap it, come down with a loose wrap, and then I'm going to pull up and then wrap around that. And hopefully my wings are on top and not curled back over. Go ahead and cinch that down tight. Then I'll come back and cut out all of the extra right next to my thread, cleaning up the eye. I think we're okay there. And then I'll bring my thread from the eye and work back towards the wing to create the head. Now the heads on Mary's flies are fairly large, and that's because of the gut that she tied in. Her hooks did not have eyes. So back then they just tied, it was actually silk. They called it gut to attach to their fly line. I'll put a whip finish on that. Now, one of the things I was taught to do is not to cut my thread, but to just put my scissors up against it and push. And then I am using a diluted goop. I have a jar. I'll just stick a needle in the jar and put that drop of goop onto the head of the fly. That goop, maybe another one. It's kind of a big head. That goop will soak in to the thread and dry clear.